My roommate stood in the center of our Manhattan apartment swirling her expensive wine, telling a room full of Wall Street brokers that I was too broke to afford groceries. She warned them not to lend me a dime. I stayed silent on my hands and knees, cleaning up the mess she just made. I let her talk. I let them laugh. They did not know a simple lease renewal document was sitting on the kitchen island behind them. When the landlord copied her on an email the next morning exposing my actual monthly income, her smug smile vanished. The color drained from her face. The sharp shatter of crystal against hardwood cut through the smooth jazz playing in the living room. 10 guests in tailored suits and silk cocktail dresses paused their conversations. I knelt on the floor in a faded college hoodie, pressing a paper towel into a pool of dark red Merlot. Sydney, my roommate and a rising public relations director, shifted her weight. She nudged the base of a second Baccarat wine glass with the pointed toe of her stiletto. It toppled off the edge of the coffee table. The fragile rim exploded inches from my bare hands. Jagged shards scattered across the wet floor, grazing my knuckles. "Watch your hands," Clara Sydney sneered. Her tone was sharp, engineered to carry across the room. "Replacing that glass takes more than your meager freelance budget can handle. Do not bleed on the rug, either." I kept my eyes on the floor. I picked up a thick piece of crystal by the stem. Her boyfriend Bryce stepped up beside her. He is a mid-tier finance broker who wears leased Rolexes to compensate for a mediocre portfolio. He tilted his own glass, letting a few drops of wine splash directly onto the sleeve of my gray hoodie. "Give her a break, Sid." Bryce chuckled, swirling his drink. "The girl cannot even pay her share of the electric bill on time. She barely scrapes by writing whatever blog posts she manages to sell. She lacks the mental capacity to notice a glass falling." The guests laughed. A polished woman near the sofa shook her head in theatrical pity. I felt their eyes scanning my worn-out clothes, tallying up my supposed worth and finding it severely lacking. I did not flinch. I did not bite my lip or rush to defend my dignity. I swept the broken shards into a dustpan with precise, steady hands. For 8 months I maintained this fiction. I paid my portion of the rent late. I ate cheap ramen. I let Sydney believe she was running a charity by allowing me to occupy the smaller bedroom in this overpriced Manhattan lease. In my actual line of work as a senior risk management consultant for Fortune 500 conglomerates, blending into the background is an essential survival tactic. I identify threats by letting arrogant people assume they hold the upper hand. Sydney and Bryce were failing the test. I stood up. I did not brush the wine off my sleeve. I looked at Sydney. She tilted her chin, waiting for me to apologize or run into my bedroom to cry. "I will handle the mess, Sydney," I said. My voice was calm and even. I turned my back to the laughing crowd and walked into the open kitchen to discard the glass. As I tossed the shards into the bin, I pulled a folded document from my hoodie pocket. It was the lease renewal application I signed earlier that afternoon. I placed it face down on the marble island, right next to Sydney's designer clutch. She thought she controlled this apartment. She did not know her name was about to become irrelevant. "My name is Clara. I am 28 years old. Before I tell you how I dismantled a toxic roommate and her fraudulent boyfriend, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogance always sets the stage for a spectacular downfall." The morning sun cut through the cheap plastic blinds of my cramped bedroom, casting long, fractured shadows across the scuffed hardwood floor. Beyond my closed door, the apartment reeked of stale Merlot and discarded luxury catering. Sydney was already awake, her sharp voice echoing down the hallway as she barked demands at the cleaning crew she hired to erase the evidence of her Tuesday night cocktail party. I sat cross-legged on my bare mattress, wearing the same faded gray hoodie from the night before. I ignored the noise. My attention remained fixed on the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. I was in the middle of restructuring a crisis response protocol for a multinational logistics firm dealing with a hostile takeover. As a senior risk management consultant, my job requires navigating corporate sabotage, predicting financial collapses, and neutralizing executives who make reckless decisions. I dismantle threats for Fortune 500 companies. I operate in the shadows, moving vast sums of capital to plug leaks in corporate defense systems. To do that effectively, anonymity is my greatest asset. My cheap clothes and sparse living conditions were a carefully constructed camouflage. A notification chime broke my concentration. A new email dropped into my secure inbox. The sender was Arthur Russo, the managing director of a premier real estate brokerage handling elite acquisitions in Tribeca. I clicked the subject line. The message contained the final paperwork for a luxury penthouse I was leasing as a secondary workspace. The text was standard legal boilerplate, but the second paragraph held the final verification, confirming the financial background check for Clara Davis. Monthly income distributions from primary investment funds verified at $450,000. Liquid assets exceed the required escrow threshold. The lease for the $25,000 a month unit is approved. Keys will be transferred upon signature. I scrolled down to verify the attachment. As my eyes tracked across the screen, I noticed a severe discrepancy in the header. A clerical error and the brokerage firm had merged their tenant roster communication list. Sitting right there in the carbon copy field was a familiar address. Sydney had received the exact same message. I did not delete the email. I did not jump out of bed to run damage control. I leaned back against the headboard, folded my hands in my lap, and counted the seconds. The sharp tapping of Sydney's designer heels down the hallway suddenly ceased. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the apartment. The cleaning staff in the living room paused their vacuum cleaner. The wooden floorboards outside my room creaked under a sudden erratic shift in weight. Footsteps charged toward my door, lacking all the refined, arrogant grace Sydney usually projected to the world. My bedroom door flew open with stunning force. The brass handle slammed into the drywall, leaving a deep, cracked indentation in the plaster. Sydney stood in the doorway. She looked nothing like the polished public relations director who had tipped a crystal wine glass at my feet 12 hours prior. The arrogant flush had vanished from her cheeks, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly white. Her hands shook with a frantic tremor, causing the stack of silver bangles on her wrist to rattle against each other. She gripped her smartphone so tight her knuckles resembled polished bone. The bright screen illuminated her panicked, hollow expression. She stared at me. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The superiority she wore like a second skin evaporated into the stagnant air of my bedroom. In its place was a potent, volatile mixture of raw shock and unadulterated envy. "What is this?" Sydney demanded. Her voice cracked, losing its cultivated elite timbre. It sounded shrill, desperate, and breathless. She marched across the small room and thrust the glowing screen of her phone inches from my face. "What kind of sick joke is this email?" I maintained my relaxed posture. I glanced at her screen, registering the identical text from Mr. Russo, then shifted my gaze back to her pale face. "It is a lease confirmation, Sydney," I replied, keeping my tone mild and entirely unbothered. $450,000 a month, Sydney shrieked. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw oxygen. She scanned my faded hoodie, the unmade bed, and the cheap plastic laundry hamper in the corner. Her mind frantically rejected the mathematics presented on the screen. "You cannot even afford the heating bill. You write generic internet articles for pocket change. What dirty trick are you playing to generate this kind of cash? Are you running a scam? Are you stealing credit cards?" She did not wait for my answer. Her panic mutated into a wild defensive aggression. Sydney lunged forward, reaching across the mattress, and snatched the laptop directly off my lap. She flipped the screen toward herself, her eyes darting frantically across my encrypted spreadsheets and risk assessment models. She searched desperately for evidence of a crime to validate her denial. She needed me to be a criminal. The alternative, that the girl she treated like a subhuman servant was quietly out-earning her entire social circle, was far too damaging to her fragile manufactured ego. "You are laundering money." Sydney hissed, her eyes scanning lines of code she could not comprehend. "Or you are an escort. That has to be it. You are selling yourself to rich men, acting like you are struggling while you hoard cash in secret." I did not jump up to wrestle the computer from her hands. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor or explain my career. I simply stood up from the bed. I stepped into her physical space, forcing her to look up at me. I extended my right hand, grasped the top edge of the laptop monitor, and slowly, deliberately pushed the screen downward until the latch clicked shut. I pulled the device out of her trembling grip with a firm, unyielding pull. "You are touching confidential corporate property, Sydney," I said, maintaining a chilling, flat delivery. "I suggest you step back before you breach a federal non-disclosure agreement." Sydney staggered back a half step. Her eyes remained locked on my face. She searched my expression for a crack in my composure, hoping to find the meek, submissive roommate she enjoyed bullying in front of her finance friends. She found nothing but cold, clinical detachment. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The email from the real estate broker was real. The income verification was real. I watched the cognitive dissonance wash over her features. A normal person would have felt a profound sense of shame. A decent human being would have recognized their own cruelty and apologized for the spilled wine, the harsh insults, and the months of relentless condescension. Sydney possessed no such decency. Instead, the panic in her eyes slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. I observed her gaze drift away from my face. She scanned the bare walls of my cheap bedroom, recalculating the unseen wealth I possessed. The sheer envy radiating from her twisted into a bottomless parasitic greed. The fear of being exposed as a fool faded, replaced by a calculating predatory hunger. She realized that the person she despised held a fortune she could only dream of touching. Her boyfriend Bryce often bragged about closing 5-figure commissions, yet here was undeniable proof that her quiet roommate generated more wealth in 30 days than Bryce handled in a decade. A dark, opportunistic intention took root behind her eyes. Sydney no longer wanted to mock me or kick me out of the apartment. She wanted to figure out how to siphon that immense wealth into her own pockets. Sydney took another step backward, retreating toward the hallway. She did not offer an apology. She did not ask another question about my career. She simply clutched her phone to her chest, her mind already spinning a web of deceit. "I will let you get back to your work, Clara," Sydney whispered, her tone shifting into a forced, unsettling calm. "We can talk about this later." She turned around and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The click of the latch sounded like the engaging mechanism of a trap. Her silence was not a surrender. It was the drafting of a new, vicious blueprint. The dynamic of our shared living space shifted, permanently setting the stage for an extortion attempt she would soon regret. I sat back down on the edge of the mattress, opened my laptop, and initiated a secondary background check on Sydney and her arrogant boyfriend. If they intended to play games with my finances, I needed to know exactly what leverage I held over their miserable lives. Sydney did not confront me regarding the leaked email. The explosive revelation of my financial status remained unspoken, hanging in the stifling air of our shared apartment like an unexploded ordnance. She adopted a facade of aggressive normalcy. She resumed her routine of complaining about the minor inconveniences of her public relations career, pointedly ignoring my presence in the common areas. Her silence was not a symptom of denial. It was a tactical maneuver. She was preparing a siege. Exactly 7 days after the real estate broker's error, I sat on a bar stool at the kitchen island, quietly reviewing a risk assessment portfolio on my tablet. The heavy thud of a manila folder striking the granite countertop broke my concentration. Sydney stood opposite me wearing a crisp, tailored blouse and an expression of practiced, condescending pity. Her boyfriend Bryce lingered just behind her, leaning his frame against the refrigerator. He held a cup of coffee, his lips curled into his signature arrogant sneer. "The building management issued a notice this morning," Sydney announced, her tone mimicking the rehearsed gravity of a corporate human resources manager delivering bad news. "They are adjusting the lease terms due to the recent neighborhood property tax hikes. The monthly rent has increased substantially." I looked down at the folder. I did not reach for it. I did not question the sudden, irregular timing of a mid-lease rent hike. Additionally, Sydney continued, her voice adopting a sharp, patronizing edge. "The utility costs for this unit have spiked over the last quarter. You leave your electronics running constantly. Given that I hold the primary lease and assume the significant financial risk of allowing a freelancer to occupy the second bedroom, it is only fair that we restructure our arrangement. Moving forward, you will be responsible for 80% of the total monthly rent, along with a newly assessed premium for your disproportionate utility consumption." She pushed the folder closer to my tablet. The printed spreadsheet inside detailed a staggering figure. The new monthly demand was nearly triple my original obligation. She had tacked on thousands of dollars in fabricated maintenance fees, common area usage penalties, and vague administrative charges. "If you are going to struggle financially, you must contribute your fair share to the household," Sydney stated, layering on a false sense of charitable mercy. "I have been extremely generous, Clara. I provided you a roof when you could barely afford to feed yourself. It is time you pulled your own weight. I cannot subsidize your lack of ambition any longer." Bryce stepped away from the refrigerator, crossing his arms over his chest to project physical dominance. "You heard her, Clara," he interjected, his voice carrying a harsh, threatening weight. "The free ride is over. You either meet the new financial requirements by the end of the day, or you pack your cheap clothes into garbage bags and find a park bench to sleep on. We will not hesitate to initiate a hostile eviction." The strategy was brutally transparent. The manufactured invoice was not a genuine attempt to cover household expenses. It was a stress test. Sydney and Bryce were intentionally squeezing my financial windpipe to verify the contents of the leaked email. If I pleaded poverty and begged for an extension, they could dismiss the six-figure income verification as a bizarre digital glitch or a pathetic lie. If I paid the exorbitant sum without a struggle, they confirmed their proximity to a massive, untapped reservoir of wealth. They cornered me, eager to expose the truth through extortion. I did not flinch. I did not argue about the illegality of a mid-lease rent increase. I did not point out the sheer absurdity of a utility surcharge that rivaled a mortgage payment. I maintained a level, clinical gaze, studying their predatory expressions. I picked up my smartphone resting next to my tablet. I opened my primary banking application. The biometric scanner unlocked the interface. I navigated to the transfer portal, typed in Sydney's routing details, saved in my directory, and entered the exact inflated dollar amount printed on her fraudulent spreadsheet. I did not hesitate. I did not bat an eye at the thousands of dollars they demanded. I tapped the confirmation button. The digital chime of a successful transaction echoed softly from my device. A fraction of a second later, Sydney's phone, resting on the countertop beside the manila folder, vibrated violently. The screen illuminated, displaying a push notification from her banking institution. "Instant transfer received. Funds available immediately." Sydney snatched her phone. Her eyes locked onto the screen, reading the confirmation message. The smug, condescending sneer she had worn since entering the kitchen dissolved instantly. Her facial muscles went slack. The flush of arrogant victory drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a stark, pallid white. She stared at the digits, her mind struggling to process the reality. She expected me to cry. She expected me to beg for a payment plan. She expected to humiliate me by forcing me to admit I could not afford her sudden demands. Instead, I had effortlessly transferred a sum of money that would have decimated her own savings account, and I did it with the casual indifference of a person buying a cup of coffee. The ease of the transaction confirmed her deepest, most desperate fear. The email was not a glitch. The staggering wealth was real. The girl she treated like a parasitic burden possessed financial resources that eclipsed her entire career trajectory. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I picked up my tablet and stood up from the bar stool. "The balance is settled, Sydney," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Let me know if the property taxes increase again." I turned my back and walked toward the hallway. I did not check their reactions. The heavy silence in the kitchen spoke louder than any argument. But my swift compliance did not satisfy their greed. The frictionless transfer of funds did not shame them into backing down. It achieved the exact opposite. It blooded the water. Before I reached my bedroom door, I heard the faint rustle of clothing as Bryce stepped closer to Sydney. I paused, listening to the shift in the atmosphere. The shock in the kitchen rapidly mutated into something far more dangerous. Sydney looked up from her glowing phone, her eyes meeting Bryce's gaze. The initial horror of her realization hardened into a feverish, volatile intensity. Bryce stared at the transaction confirmation on her screen, his jaw tight, his pupils dilated. The contempt he usually held for me vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger. He looked at Sydney, and a silent, mutual understanding passed between them. A few $1,000s extorted through fake utility bills was no longer sufficient. They had just struck a vein of gold, and they were not going to stop digging. The extortion was only the opening move. A much larger, infinitely more destructive plan began to crystallize in Bryce's mind. The atmosphere inside the apartment thickened over the following days, heavy with a silent, suffocating greed. Sydney stopped demanding I clean the common areas. Bryce stopped making loud, disparaging jokes about my career when he walked past my closed door. Their sudden, unnatural politeness was far more alarming than their previous hostility. They watched me with the intense, focused energy of predators observing a trapped asset. They were no longer trying to force me out. They were trying to figure out how to consume me. The tension broke momentarily with the arrival of Donovan. Donovan is a formidable presence. He is a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man who moves with deliberate, economical grace. He is the husband of Lauren Sidney's older sister. Unlike the flashy, status-obsessed circles Sidney and Bryce desperately clung to, Donovan operated in reality. He is a senior audit director at a premier financial forensics firm. He built his career from the ground up, navigating the grueling ascent from a working-class neighborhood in Chicago to the top tier of corporate accountability. He possesses a razor-sharp intellect and a profound, silent disdain for the superficial posturing of his wife's family, particularly Bryce's hollow arrogance. Donovan never wore a leased watch. He never spoke louder than necessary. He simply observed. Donovan and Lauren arrived on a Thursday afternoon for a brief, obligatory family visit before a dinner reservation. While Lauren and Sidney chatted loudly in the living room, analyzing the latest society gossip, the men dispersed. I emerged from my bedroom to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. As I passed the entryway console where the Daily Mail was sorted, I caught a sudden erratic movement out of the corner of my eye. Bryce was standing near the front door. He held a stack of envelopes, supposedly searching for a package slip. His back was turned to the living room, but his hands moved with a frantic, focused speed. He was not looking at his own mail. He was holding a thick manila envelope bearing the insignia of my primary banking institution. He held it up toward the hallway light, attempting to read the contents through the paper without breaking the seal. Before I could step forward and demand he drop my private correspondence, a heavy hand clamped down on Bryce's shoulder. Donovan stepped out of the adjacent coat closet. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene to alert the women in the living room. He simply squeezed Bryce's shoulder with enough physical force to make the younger man flinch. "Are you looking for something specific?" Bryce Donovan asked. His tone was smooth, chilling, and entirely devoid of warmth. Bryce jumped, nearly dropping the stack of mail. He shoved my bank envelope back into the communal sorting tray, his face flushing a dark, guilty red. "Just checking the utility bills," Bryce stammered, stepping away from the console and hurrying back toward the safety of the living room chatter without making eye contact. Donovan watched him retreat. He did not follow. He turned his head and locked eyes with me standing in the kitchen doorway. His expression remained unreadable, a perfectly neutral mask engineered by years of conducting hostile corporate audits. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod toward the narrow hallway leading to the guest bathroom. I set my water glass down on the counter. I walked down the corridor, staying out of the direct line of sight from the living room. A moment later, Donovan stepped into the hallway, pulling the door to the coat closet shut behind him to create a temporary blind spot. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached out and pressed a small folded piece of stiff paper directly into the palm of my hand. His fingers were cold. "Check your comprehensive credit reports," Clara Donovan instructed. His voice was a low, steady rumble carrying a lethal, urgent weight. "Do it immediately. Do not wait for the morning." I looked down at the folded paper, then back up at the towering auditor. "What did you see?" I asked quietly. Donovan leaned in closer, ensuring his words would not carry beyond the narrow walls of the hallway. "Bryce is bleeding out," he whispered. "I reviewed the internal compliance filings at his brokerage firm this morning. His firm is initiating termination proceedings by the end of the week. Bryce engaged in highly leveraged, unauthorized trading. He is currently facing a catastrophic margin call. He owes his primary clearinghouse $5 million, and his personal assets are entirely liquidated. He is a desperate man cornered by institutional debt." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent clarity. Bryce's sudden interest in my mail, Sidney's immediate shift in behavior after receiving the real estate email, the exorbitant rent demands. They were not trying to squeeze a few extra $1,000 out of a wealthy roommate. They were hunting for a lifeline. They do not just want your rent money. Clara Donovan continued, confirming my immediate, horrifying realization. They are hunting for a sacrificial lamb. A man facing a $5 million margin call does not look for loose change. He looks for a clean financial profile he can exploit to secure an emergency corporate loan to cover his margins. Bryce was analyzing your bank statements to verify your credit capacity. He is targeting your identity. Donovan stepped back, restoring a polite professional distance between us. He adjusted the cuffs of his immaculately tailored suit jacket. He had delivered the warning. The rest was up to me. "Protect your borders," Clara Donovan said softly. "These people are drowning, and they will not hesitate to pull you under the water to save themselves." He turned and walked back into the living room, seamlessly rejoining the shallow conversation with his wife and sister-in-law, as if the exchange in the hallway had never occurred. I stood alone in the dim corridor, clutching the small piece of paper tightly in my fist. The extortion attempt had escalated into a severe federal threat. If Bryce intended to hijack my financial identity to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, he was committing wire fraud and identity theft on a massive scale. He planned to forge a chain of debt that would ruin my flawless credit rating and potentially entangle me in a criminal investigation. I did not panic. I did not storm into the living room and accuse him. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door securely behind me. I opened my encrypted laptop. I bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus and logged directly into the high-security monitoring portals I utilize for my corporate clients. I needed to see exactly how deep the infection had spread before I amputated the diseased limb. The silent auditor had handed me the match. It was time to locate the bomb. Donovan's warning proved chillingly accurate. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, the harsh blue light of my monitor casting sharp angles across the walls. I bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus and tapped directly into the proprietary high-level monitoring nodes I maintained for my corporate risk portfolio. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, a silent, flashing red alert illuminated the top right corner of my dashboard. The security perimeter holding my personal financial identity had been breached. I traced the digital footprint of the inquiry. The data packets originated from a localized IP address. The ping came from the living room router less than 30 feet from where I sat. While I remained sealed in my room, Bryce and Sydney were sitting on the expensive leather sofa, actively dissecting my life. They had successfully extracted my social security number, my primary tax identification codes, and a secondary set of banking routing digits from the physical mail Bryce had intercepted at the console. I watched the live feed of the financial inquiries populate on my screen. They were not attempting to open a modest consumer credit card to fund a shopping spree. The scale of the theft was breathtaking, fueled by Bryce's impending $5 million margin call. The monitoring software detected a hard credit pull originating from a commercial lending institution headquartered in Chicago. Bryce was executing a sophisticated corporate identity theft. He utilized my flawless high-net-worth credit profile to establish an independent commercial entity, a shell corporation entirely devoid of any actual business operations. He filed an application for an expedited unsecured commercial credit line totaling $3 million. He intended to inject the illicit funds directly into his collapsing cryptocurrency portfolio. Hoping the massive influx of stolen capital would cover his margin deficit before his brokerage initiated the termination proceedings Donovan had outlined. He transformed my personal identity into a disposable digital life raft, fully intending to let me drown under the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar default. The application status updated on my screen in real time. Initial underwriting approved. Pending final digital signature verification. A lesser person would have panicked. A normal citizen would have immediately contacted the credit bureaus, frozen their accounts, and dialed the local police precinct to report the crime. I did not freeze the accounts. Freezing the accounts would only temporarily halt the transaction, alerting Bryce to my surveillance and allowing him to retreat, destroy the physical evidence, and claim a misunderstanding. I did not want a misunderstanding. I wanted a federal conviction. I picked up my encrypted mobile device and dialed the direct line to the lead forensic investigator on my payroll. The call connected after a single ring. Monitor the incoming commercial credit application originating from the Chicago routing node, I instructed, keeping my voice low and devoid of any emotional inflection. Do not block the initial approval. Let the underwriting process complete. Authorize the digital signature verification. I want you to establish a secure mirrored holding account to receive the disbursed funds. Trap the capital the moment it clears the lender. Understood. Clara, the investigator, replied smoothly. We are establishing the honeypot protocol now. They will believe the funds are accessible, but every transaction attempt will generate a hard-coded federal evidence log. I disconnected the call and closed my laptop. The trap was set. Bryce believed he had successfully stolen $3 million. He had actually just finalized his own indictment for federal wire fraud. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Sydney stood near the espresso machine, radiating a manic, triumphant energy. Her posture had completely shifted overnight. The desperate, calculating tension was gone, replaced by a grotesque, arrogant swagger. She believed the $3 million credit line had saved them. She believed my wealth was now officially her wealth. She held a generic paper coffee cup from a corner bodega. She did not offer me a greeting. She simply tossed the cheap cup onto the granite countertop in front of me. The hot liquid sloshed over the rim, staining a stack of mail. "Clean up the apartment," Clara Sidney commanded, her voice dripping with venomous, unearned superiority. "We are hosting a private gathering tonight. Bryce is bringing in several major investment partners to celebrate a highly successful portfolio acquisition. Vacuum the living room and ensure the catering staging area is clear." She paused, looking me up and down with intense theatrical disgust, taking in my simple jeans and faded sweater. "And please stay out of sight once the guests arrive." Sydney added, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "I do not want you wandering around looking like a homeless shelter reject. We have important people arriving, and I refuse to let your pathetic aesthetic embarrass us in our own home." She turned and marched out of the kitchen, her designer heels clicking triumphantly against the hardwood floor. I stood alone in the kitchen looking at the spilled coffee. She was using the illusion of the $3 million she had just stolen from my identity to fund a lavish party for Wall Street executives. She planned to parade around the apartment boasting of her sudden financial success, entirely unaware that the capital she intended to flaunt was currently locked inside a federal evidence trap designed by the very woman she just ordered to vacuum her rug. My initial cold anger crystallized into a pristine, lethal focus. I did not argue with her. I did not refuse the order to clean. I picked up a damp cloth and methodically wiped the spilled coffee from the granite counter. I would attend her celebration. I would stay out of sight just as she requested. I would blend into the background, a silent observer in the room, waiting for the perfect catastrophic moment to introduce her important guests to the true owner of the apartment. The apartment transformed by 8 o'clock that evening. Sydney had utilized the illusion of the $3 million credit line to hire a premier catering service and a private bartender. The living room buzzed with the low, aggressive hum of Wall Street networking. Men in bespoke suits and women in designer cocktail dresses congregated around the marble kitchen island, holding expensive champagne and discussing volatile market trends. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the arrogant posturing of the Manhattan financial elite. Sydney found me in the kitchen before the first guests arrived. She handed me a cheap, ill-fitting black apron, the kind used by back-of-house kitchen staff. "Put this on." Sydney ordered, her eyes flashing with a cruel, vindictive pleasure. "The catering staff is short-handed. You are going to pass hors d'oeuvres and collect empty glasses. Try not to drop anything, Clara. We have executives in the room tonight whose hourly rate exceeds your entire annual earning potential." I did not refuse. I accepted the black apron. I tied the strings behind my back, effectively erasing my identity and adopting the role of the invisible, subservient laborer she desired. I picked up a silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and navigated the crowded living room. I moved silently through the clusters of wealthy guests, offering drinks and clearing abandoned napkins. Sydney and Bryce stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, holding court with a group of senior financial brokers. As I approached their circle to offer a fresh glass of champagne, Bryce noticed my proximity. He did not lower his voice. He intentionally raised the volume of his conversation, ensuring the surrounding guests heard his assessment. "That is Clara, our resident charity case," Bryce announced, gesturing toward me with his half-empty glass. He offered the surrounding brokers a condescending, manufactured sigh. "She claims to be a freelance writer, but the reality is she cannot even secure a basic consumer credit card. Her financial profile is a complete disaster. We took pity on her and allowed her to occupy the spare room, but honestly, keeping her afloat is becoming a significant liability." The brokers chuckled, sipping their drinks and casting brief, dismissive glances in my direction. They viewed me as a pathetic anecdote, a minor inconvenience in Bryce's otherwise successful life. Sydney quickly chimed in, eager to solidify the narrative. She needed to logically explain how a supposedly destitute freelancer could afford the exorbitant fabricated rent demands she had successfully extorted from me earlier in the week. She leaned in close to a female executive, lowering her voice into a theatrical, conspiratorial whisper that was entirely audible to anyone standing within 10 feet. "It is incredibly tragic," Sydney whispered, feigning a deep, sympathetic sorrow. "Clara has resorted to some very unsavory methods to cover her basic living expenses. We discovered she is operating as a companion for older, wealthy men. A sugar baby, essentially, though, a rather unsuccessful one. She is drowning in personal debt, constantly rotating through terrible situations just to survive. We try to provide a stable environment, but her lifestyle choices are deeply concerning. The character assassination was thorough and merciless. The rumor spread through the party with the rapid, toxic efficiency of a localized contagion. The guests I served no longer simply ignored me. They observed me with a potent mixture of revulsion and voyeuristic curiosity. I caught the harsh, judgmental whispers as I walked past the velvet armchairs. I saw the disgusted sneers aimed at my cheap apron. Sydney had successfully painted me as a desperate, financially ruined sex worker, entirely dependent on her benevolent charity. I stood in the center of the sprawling living room, gripping the edges of the silver tray. The sheer weight of their collective contempt pressed down on me. A normal person would have thrown the tray onto the floor, screamed the truth, and stormed out of the apartment in tears. I maintained my posture. I kept my spine straight and my facial expression completely devoid of emotion. I absorbed the humiliation without flinching because my attention was no longer focused on Sydney or Bryce. My eyes were locked on a middle-aged man standing directly beside Bryce near the windows. He wore a tailored dark navy suit. He possessed the quiet, commanding presence of a man who controlled vast sums of institutional wealth. He was not laughing at Bryce's crude jokes. He was staring directly at me, his brow furrowed in profound, absolute shock. The man was Jonathan Vance. He was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, one of the largest private equity funds on the eastern seaboard. I was also the primary client who had signed a highly confidential 8-figure risk management contract with my consulting firm exactly 7 days prior. Jonathan Vance had spent 3 hours sitting across from me in a secure, encrypted boardroom, listening as I outlined the catastrophic vulnerabilities in his international supply chain. He knew precisely who I was. He knew the scale of the capital I managed, and he understood the lethal accuracy of my financial audits. He stared at the cheap black apron tied around my waist. He looked at the silver tray in my hands. He listened to Bryce, a desperate broker facing a massive margin call, loudly mock the most powerful risk consultant in the financial sector for lacking a basic credit card. Jonathan Vance's eyes met mine. The confusion on his face rapidly mutated into a terrifying, crystalline realization. He understood that he had just walked into a very active, highly volatile trap. I offered him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Do not interfere," the nod communicated. "Watch the execution." I turned away from the CEO and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving Bryce to continue boasting to a man who now viewed him not as a peer, but as a dead man walking. The party continued, fueled by stolen identity and arrogant lies, entirely unaware that the executioner was already inside the room serving the drinks. The morning following the apartment party, Bryce departed early, radiating a manic, triumphant energy. I wore a brand-new tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold watch he had likely purchased on credit the moment the initial loan underwriting was approved. He carried a leather briefcase containing the fraudulent corporate documentation he generated using my stolen Social Security number and tax identity. He was heading to the Midtown headquarters of Vanguard Holdings. He believed he was walking into a routine closing meeting to finalize the $3 million commercial credit line that would save his collapsing cryptocurrency portfolio and erase his looming margin debt. He was walking into a slaughterhouse. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bryce sat inside the primary glass-walled conference room at Vanguard Holdings. The room projected absolute institutional power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline. The massive mahogany table was surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. Bryce sat near the center of the table, confidently distributing glossy presentation folders to the 3 senior underwriting executives seated across from him. He smiled, utilizing his practiced aggressive sales charm, explaining the projected return on investment for his fabricated shell corporation. I stood in the corridor outside the glass walls, flanked by 2 private security contractors employed by my firm. I did not wear a faded hoodie or a cheap catering apron. I wore a sharp, immaculately tailored black pantsuit. My hair was pulled back into a severe professional style. I embodied the aesthetic of a senior corporate assassin. I did not knock. I placed my hand on the heavy stainless steel handle and pushed the glass door open. The heavy door swung wide, striking the rubber stopper with a dull, resonant thud. The conversation inside the boardroom ceased immediately. The 3 underwriting executives stopped reviewing the fraudulent documents and looked up. Bryce turned his head wearing an annoyed expression, expecting to see an administrative assistant arriving with coffee or water. His eyes locked onto my face. The arrogant, polished smile melted off his features instantly. The color drained from his skin, leaving him a stark, sickly white. His jaw slackened. The glossy presentation folder he was holding slipped from his paralyzed fingers, the thick pages fanning out and scattering across the polished mahogany surface. He stared at the immaculate black suit, the confident posture, and the 2 massive security contractors securing the door behind me. His brain violently rejected the visual data it was receiving. He was looking at the broke, desperate roommate his girlfriend routinely humiliated. Jonathan Vance, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, sat at the head of the table. He did not look surprised by my sudden entrance. He stood up from his leather chair and offered a polite, deeply respectful nod in my direction. Clara Jonathan said, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Please take the advisory chair. We require your final assessment on this commercial credit application." I walked the length of the conference room. I did not look at Bryce. I maintained a steady, purposeful stride, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I reached the empty chair positioned directly to the right of the CEO, the seat designated for the chief risk advisor. I sat down, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and finally turned my gaze toward the trembling man seated across the table. Bryce looked like he had been struck by lightning. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. The reality of the situation was crushing him in real time. The woman he mocked in his living room, the woman he paraded around as a destitute charity case, was currently occupying the highest advisory seat at the very institution he was attempting to defraud. I reached forward and picked up the glossy presentation folder Bryce had dropped. I opened the cover, glancing briefly at the fabricated financial projections and the forged corporate registration numbers. I did not bother reading the details. The data was irrelevant. I closed the folder. I grasped the thick cardstock binding with both hands. I applied a sharp, decisive force and tore the entire document in half. The sound of ripping paper was deafening in the quiet room. I tossed the destroyed pieces back onto the center of the table. This application relies entirely on stolen personal identification data and fabricated financial reporting, I announced to the room, keeping my tone freezing clinical and completely devoid of empathy. The applicant has utilized a stolen Social Security number to construct a shell entity for the purpose of covering a catastrophic personal margin deficit. The collateral is non-existent. The corporate entity is a fraud. I advise immediate rejection of the credit facility and simultaneous notification of federal authorities regarding wire fraud and identity theft. Bryce shattered. The quiet, desperate terror mutated into a volatile, explosive rage. The realization that his financial salvation was destroyed by the very person he viewed as subhuman broke his remaining sanity. He lunged forward, slamming both of his palms flat against the mahogany table. "What the hell are you doing here?" Bryce roared, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "You are a maid. You are a pathetic freelancer living off our charity. You cannot reject my application. You do not have the authority to sit in that chair." He scrambled over the top of the table, reaching blindly across the wood, his eyes wide and feral, desperate to silence me, desperate to unwrite the execution order I had just delivered. He never reached me. The two security contractors standing by the door moved with terrifying speed. They crossed the room in 3 strides. The lead contractor grabbed Bryce by the collar of his expensive Italian suit and the back of his belt. He hauled the finance broker off the table and slammed him face first onto the hardwood floor. The heavy thud of bone-striking wood echoed through the boardroom. The second contractor immediately drove a knee directly between Bryce's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground while wrenching his arms firmly behind his back. Bryce thrashed against the floor, his face pressed awkwardly against the polished wood. He screamed obscenities, his voice muffled by the pressure of the contractor pinning him down. The polished Wall Street broker was reduced to a writhing, hysterical criminal in a matter of minutes. I stood up from my chair. I walked around the edge of the conference table and looked down at the man struggling uselessly against the security personnel. "I am not the maid, Bryce," I said quietly, ensuring my voice cut through his panicked shouting. "And you are no longer a finance broker. You are a federal liability. The funds you attempted to steal were locked in a holding account hours ago. The FBI has the digital footprint of your application, and Vanguard Holdings will be handing over the security footage of this meeting to the prosecution." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his. "I strongly suggest you call a defense attorney," I whispered. "But I suspect you no longer have the credit score required to afford one." I straightened my posture, nodded once to Jonathan Vance, and walked out of the glass boardroom. I did not look back at the ruined man screaming my name from the floor. The financial execution was complete. The trap had sprung flawlessly. But I knew the conflict was not entirely resolved. The destruction of Bryce's career would inevitably trigger a desperate, violent reaction from Sydney back at the apartment. The battle was moving from the boardroom back to my own front door, and I was ready to finalize the eviction. The termination of the fraudulent credit line triggered an immediate volatile chain reaction. Bryce, pinned to the floor of the Vanguard boardroom and facing imminent federal charges, utilized his single permitted phone call before being taken into custody. He did not call a defense attorney. He called Sydney. He relayed the catastrophic failure of their extortion plot, painting me as a malicious saboteur who had infiltrated his business meeting to destroy his reputation. He ignited her fury, transforming her greed into a violent, retaliatory rage. I anticipated the backlash. I did not return to the apartment immediately. I spent the afternoon finalizing the transfer protocols for my next strategic maneuver. When I finally arrived on my residential floor, at 4 o'clock, the elevator doors slid open to reveal a scene of calculated, chaotic destruction. My personal belongings were scattered across the length of the carpeted hallway. My sweaters, my winter coat, and the few physical books I kept in my room were piled haphazardly near the elevator bank. My toiletries were dumped out of a plastic bin, a bottle of expensive shampoo shattered against the baseboard, leaking a fragrant sticky pool onto the carpet. Standing in the center of the wreckage, blocking the doorway to the apartment, was Sydney. She wore her signature designer athleisure wear, her arms crossed aggressively over her chest. Her face was flushed a dark, angry red. The carefully constructed mask of the polished public relations director was entirely gone. She looked feral, consumed by a vicious, unadulterated hatred. She had spent the last 2 hours physically hauling my possessions out of the apartment, attempting to assert dominance through sheer spatial control. "You actually had the audacity to come back here!" Sydney shrieked, her voice echoing down the long corridor, bouncing off the heavy oak doors of the neighboring units. "You destroyed Bryce's career. You sabotaged his funding. You are a psychotic, manipulative liar. Get your trash out of my hallway and get out of this building before I have you arrested." I stepped out of the elevator. I did not rush forward to gather my clothes. I did not shout or demand entry. I stood perfectly still, surveying the mess with a cold, clinical detachment. "This is my residence, Sydney," I stated, keeping my voice low and even a sharp contrast to her hysterical shouting. "You have unlawfully removed my property from my dwelling." "Your residence," Sydney scoffed, letting out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You do not own anything here. I am the primary leaseholder. My name is on the contract. I allowed you to sublet that tiny room out of charity. I am terminating our arrangement effective immediately. You are trespassing." She took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. She looked down at the floor, spotting my secondary laptop, a burner device I used for basic internet browsing, not my encrypted workstation lying near her feet. She raised her foot and brought the sharp steel-reinforced stiletto heel of her designer boot down hard onto the center of the closed laptop. The plastic casing cracked with a sharp, brittle snap. the LCD screen spiderwebbed underneath the pressure. "You sat in my kitchen pretending you could barely afford groceries while hoarding millions of dollars," Sydney hissed, grinding her heel into the broken laptop. "You played the victim while plotting to ruin us. You are a deceitful, fraudulent parasite. I am calling the police right now. I will have you charged with breaking and entering, and I will ensure they know exactly what kind of financial scam you are running." The sheer audacity of her projection was remarkable. She was actively destroying my property, attempting an illegal, undocumented eviction, and threatening to involve law enforcement to cover up the fact that she and her boyfriend had committed federal identity theft. She believed her status as the primary leaseholder granted her absolute immunity. She thought casting me out into the hallway without a single piece of documentation would humiliate me into submission. The commotion in the hallway drew an audience. The heavy oak doors of 2 adjacent apartments clicked open. An elderly couple peeked out from their unit, their eyes wide with concern. A younger man in a business suit stood in his doorway, holding a cell phone, likely debating whether to call building security. Sydney noticed the neighbors watching. She straightened her posture, relishing the audience determined to play the aggrieved victim, throwing out a dangerous interloper. She smiled a cold, triumphant smirk, entirely convinced she had won the confrontation. She believed she had successfully stripped me of my home and my dignity in front of an audience. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not cry over the broken laptop. I slowly bent down, gripping the cracked plastic casing, and lifted the ruined device from the carpet. I held it casually under my arm. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved my mobile phone. I did not dial emergency services. I did not call my legal team. I dialed a number I had saved in my contacts earlier that week. The line rang once. "It is time, Mr. Russo," I said into the receiver, keeping my voice clear and audible to the entire hallway. "Please come up to the penthouse floor immediately." I disconnected the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. "Who are you calling?" "Sydney," demanded her triumphant smirk, faltering slightly, replaced by a flicker of uneasy confusion. "The building manager is not going to help you, Clara. He knows I hold the lease. He will help me throw your garbage onto the street." I did not answer her. I simply stood in the hallway surrounded by my scattered belongings and waited. The power dynamic was about to undergo a violent, irreversible shift, and Sydney had absolutely no idea that the very ground she was standing on had already been sold out from beneath her feet. The heavy brass doors of the primary elevator slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. Arthur Russo, the senior managing director of the real estate conglomerate that operated the building, stepped out onto the plush carpet of the penthouse floor. He was accompanied by 2 towering, broad-shouldered men wearing the dark, tailored suits of elite private security contractors. They were not the standard building concierges. They were highly trained professionals, dispatched for high-risk asset protection. Sydney immediately seized the opportunity to control the narrative. She abandoned her defensive posture, blocking the doorway, and rushed toward Mr. Russo, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She threw her hands up in a theatrical display of exasperation, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. "Mr. Russo." "Thank God you are here," Sydney exclaimed, her voice vibrating with manufactured outrage. "I need you to call the police immediately and have this woman forcibly removed from the premises. She is a dangerous, unstable individual. She broke my computer, she is causing a massive disturbance, and she refuses to leave. My name is the only name on the primary lease agreement for this unit. She has absolutely zero legal right to be standing on this floor. Have your security guards escort her out of the building." The 2 neighbors who had been watching the commotion from their cracked doorways leaned in closer, eager to witness the eviction of the disruptive tenant. Sydney stood tall, her chest puffed out, radiating the smug, absolute certainty of a woman who believed the established hierarchy would always protect her. Mr. Russo did not instruct his security team to apprehend me. He did not look at my scattered belongings. He looked at Sydney. His expression was not one of compliance or concern. It was a look of profound clinical pity. He looked at her the way a seasoned executive looks at an employee who is completely unaware they have already been terminated. Mr. Russo stepped around Sydney, ignoring her frantic demands entirely. He walked deliberately down the hallway, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of where I stood. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a heavy, velvet-lined box. He opened the box, revealing a master set of brass keys attached to a solid gold key ring. He held the box out to me, offering a deep, respectful bow of his head. "Ms. Davis," Mr. Russo announced, his voice carrying the formal, resonant tone of a man executing a major corporate transaction. "The final escrow transfers cleared 15 minutes ago. The title deeds and all associated property management portfolios have been successfully transferred and recorded with the county clerk. This entire residential tower now officially belongs to your holding company. Congratulations on your acquisition." I reached out and took the keys from the velvet box. The brass felt heavy and cold against my palm. "Thank you, Arthur. I appreciate your swift execution of the paperwork." Sydney staggered backward, her stiletto heel catching on the edge of the carpet runner. She grabbed the decorative molding around her doorway to steady herself. All the blood rushed from her face, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords paralyzed. She stared at the gold keyring in my hand, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. "What are you talking about?" Sydney finally gasped, her voice reduced to a thin, reedy whisper. She looked wildly from Mr. Russo to me, searching for a punchline that did not exist. "She is a roommate. She is a freelancer. She pays me rent. She does not own this building." Mr. Russo turned to face Sydney, his expression hardening into cold, professional detachment. "Ms. Davis did not renew her sublet application, Miss Sydney. When the ownership group signaled their intention to liquidate this specific asset portfolio last week, Ms. Davis bypassed the retail market entirely. She executed a cash acquisition of the entire corporate entity that owns this structure. She is no longer your roommate. She is your landlord." The reality of the situation crushed Sydney in real time. The arrogant, untouchable public relations director realized she had just attempted to illegally evict a multimillionaire from her own property. She had spent the last hour screaming threats and destroying the personal belongings of the woman who now held absolute legal authority over her living situation. The neighbors watching from their doorways quickly closed their doors, recognizing that the power dynamic had shifted in a terrifying, absolute direction. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Sydney flinched, shrinking back against the doorframe, terrified of the woman she had tormented for 8 months. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the heavy oak door of the apartment. I pushed it wide open. I stepped past her, entering the foyer of my own property. I paused in the entryway and turned back to look at Sydney, who remained frozen in the hallway, surrounded by the clothes she had thrown out. "By the way, Sydney," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional warmth. "According to the updated tenant bylaws I initiated this morning, any personal property left unattended in the communal hallways is considered abandoned garbage and will be immediately incinerated by the maintenance staff." I let my gaze drop to the shattered remains of my burner laptop lying near her feet, then slowly brought my eyes back up to meet hers. Furthermore, I continued my tone, slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "Since your primary lease explicitly forbids criminal activity on the premises, including the harboring of individuals facing federal wire fraud charges, your tenancy is hereby terminated for cause. You have until 5 o'clock this evening to remove yourself and your remaining possessions from my property. If you are found inside this unit at 5 o'clock and 1 minute, my security team will detain you and the police will arrest you for criminal trespassing." I reached out and grasped the brass handle of the door. "Start packing," I whispered. I pulled the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, definitive crack, sealing Sydney out in the hallway with her ruined ego and the terrifying realization that she had just lost everything. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and prepared to execute the next phase of the financial demolition. The click of the deadbolt securing the apartment door was merely the conclusion of a minor territorial dispute. The true execution was digital, and it was already in motion. I walked past the empty space where Bryce usually dropped his keys, past the velvet sofa where Sydney hosted her condescending wine nights, and entered the master bedroom I had just officially claimed. I opened my encrypted workstation. The acquisition of the building was a display of structural power. What followed was a surgical strike designed to sever their financial arteries entirely. Using the forensic data packets captured during Bryce's attempted identity theft, I compiled a comprehensive dossier mapping his entire illicit financial network. He had linked the fraudulent $3 million commercial credit line to a web of secondary accounts, preparing to funnel the stolen capital into his collapsing cryptocurrency margin. He believed the funds were secure, waiting for his final authorization to deploy. He did not know he was operating inside a heavily monitored quarantine zone. I initiated a secure connection to the primary fraud prevention directors at 3 major banking institutions. I did not submit a consumer complaint. I submitted a Priority 1 executive risk alert, attaching the irrefutable digital footprint of the forged Social Security number, verification, and the spoofed IP addresses originating from my router. The banking algorithms reacted with ruthless automated efficiency. Within 45 minutes, I watched the confirmation codes cascade across my monitor. The institutions executed a global freeze injunction. Every single account tied to the fraudulent corporate entity, and by extension, every personal checking, savings, and credit account bearing. Bryce's name was instantly locked down, pending federal review. His financial blood supply was severed. That evening, a heavy driving rain swept across Manhattan. The temperature plummeted, matching the harsh reality settling over my former roommates. I monitored the situation from the comfort of my penthouse living room, watching the logs of their desperation light up my secure server. At 7:15, a transaction alert triggered on Bryce's primary platinum credit card. Location: a dilapidated budget motel in deep Queens. Status: declined. At 7:22, another alert triggered. A secondary debit card. Location: a fast food drive-through 2 blocks from the motel. Status: declined. Insufficient funds. Account frozen. They were locked out of their own lives. They could not secure a room for the night. They could not purchase a hot meal. The millions of dollars Bryce thought he had successfully stolen were vapor, and his legitimate assets were seized by the very institutions he tried to defraud. The psychological break occurred exactly at 8 o'clock. My burner phone, resting on the granite kitchen island, began to vibrate continuously. The screen displayed Bryce's number. I did not answer. The call went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again, and again. The incoming calls transformed into a frantic, sustained barrage of electronic desperation. I picked up the phone, bypassed the lock screen, and accessed the visual voicemail interface. I did not listen to the audio directly. I watched the voice-to-text transcription software transcribe his escalating hysteria in real time. First voicemail, 8:02 p.m. Clara, what did you do to my accounts? The bank is saying there is a fraud hold. Fix this right now, or I swear I am coming back to that building and dragging you out by your hair. Fourth voicemail, 8:12 p.m. You psychotic bitch. You locked my cards. You have no idea who you are messing with. I will destroy your life. I will find out where you work and burn it to the ground. Answer the phone. Ninth voicemail, 8:30 p.m. I am going to kill you, Clara. I am going to find you and kill you. You stole my money. You ruined my life. Bryce was spiraling into a violent, unhinged rage, completely blind to the trap he was actively tightening around his own neck. He did not realize that every screamed threat, every profane promise of physical violence, was being recorded in high-definition audio. The voicemails were not sitting on my phone. The device was configured to automatically upload every incoming message to a secure cloud server, instantly forwarding the audio files directly to my legal team and the FBI task force monitoring his wire fraud case. Bryce was not just threatening me, he was formally documenting his intent to commit assault and extortion, providing the prosecution with an airtight motive. At 9 o'clock, the phone vibrated with a different notification. A text message from Sydney. Clara, please. I am terrified. Bryce is losing his mind. He is throwing things. I had nothing to do with the credit card thing, I swear. He forced me to go along with it. I am sleeping in the car because we cannot get a room. Please just unfreeze my checking account so I can get away from him. I am so sorry for everything. Please help me. I stared at the block of text. Sydney, the woman who had intentionally dropped a crystal glass at my feet and attempted to destroy my laptop just hours ago, was now playing the fragile, abused victim. She was attempting to rewrite her role from a willing accomplice to a helpless hostage. She expected her manufactured tears to override the data. She expected mercy. I did not reply. I did not block the number. I simply placed the phone back down on the granite counter and walked away. Silence is the most terrifying response to a person who thrives on manipulation. It confirms their total lack of control. The financial chokehold was absolute. Without access to capital, without a place to sleep, and with the impending threat of federal investigators closing in on their forged loan, Bryce and Sydney were suffocating in the dark. The pressure I applied stripped away their arrogance, their social standing, and their ability to survive independently. By morning, the sheer crushing weight of their poverty would force them to seek the only remaining shelter available. They would have to crawl back to the very people Sydney spent her life trying to impress, setting the stage for a spectacular family reckoning. The total financial freeze executed its intended purpose flawlessly. Destitute, terrified, and cornered by the impending collapse of Bryce's fraudulent loan, Sydney sought the only remaining avenue of salvation. She summoned her family. The following afternoon, she arranged an emergency meeting at an upscale bistro in the financial district, a location likely chosen to project an illusion of stability to her parents, despite her inability to pay for a single appetizer. I received the location parameters via an encrypted message from Donovan 2 hours prior to the meeting. He understood the trajectory of the crisis. He knew Sydney would attempt to spin a narrative of victimhood, and he provided the coordinates to ensure the execution was precise. I arrived at the bistro 15 minutes early. I wore a sharp, minimalist trench coat blending seamlessly into the lunchtime crowd of corporate executives. I requested a small corner booth partially obscured by a decorative frosted glass partition. It offered a clear line of sight to the large circular table reserved under Sydney's family name, while shielding me from immediate detection. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Sydney and Bryce arrived first. They looked ragged, the physical toll of spending a rainy night in a cheap sedan, evident in their wrinkled clothing and exhausted posture. Sydney's parents arrived next, followed closely by Lauren and Donovan. As soon as the family was seated, Sydney launched into her performance. From my secluded booth, I could hear the desperate theatrical tremor in her voice. She wove a masterpiece of complete fiction. She painted me as an unstable, manipulative predator who had somehow conned the building management into stealing her lease. She claimed I was a psychotic hacker who had illegally frozen Bryce's legitimate business accounts out of sheer malicious jealousy. She sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the innocent, traumatized daughter perfectly. "I cannot believe she did this to us," Sydney whimpered, leaning heavily against her mother's shoulder. "She threw us out onto the street. Bryce is going to lose his job because he cannot access his client funds. She is a monster mom. We need to call the police and have her arrested for theft and cybercrimes." Her parents reacted with predictable, outraged indignation. Her father slammed his fist against the table, demanding the name of the building manager and vowing to hire a litigation firm to destroy me. Lauren gasped in horror, offering sympathetic murmurs. Bryce sat silently beside Sydney, nodding grimly, playing the stoic victim. He believed the lie was working. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and stood up from my booth. I did not rush. I walked around the frosted glass partition with the measured, deliberate stride of an apex predator stepping into the clearing. I carried a thick, heavy manila folder under my left arm. I approached the circular table from behind Sydney's chair. The conversation halted abruptly as Lauren noticed my approach, her eyes widening in recognition. Sydney followed her sister's gaze, turning her head. The manufactured tears vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Bryce stiffened his hand, instinctively gripping the edge of the table as if preparing to flee. "Hello, Sydney," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, chilling calm that contrasted violently with the heated outrage of her parents. "I understand you are discussing my legal status. I thought I might provide some clarity." Before her father could unleash his prepared tirade, I swung the heavy manila folder forward and dropped it directly into the center of the table. The loud slap of the thick paper hitting the wood silenced the entire group. "Before you call the police to report a stolen apartment, I suggested locking eyes with Sydney's horrified parents. You might want to ask your son-in-law to explain the mathematics contained in that folder." I did not point a finger. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my gaze toward Donovan. The towering auditor sat perfectly still at the edge of the table. He did not look surprised by my sudden appearance. He did not offer a greeting. He simply reached forward with large, steady hands and pulled the manila folder toward him. He opened the cover with clinical precision, his dark eyes scanning the top sheet of the compiled dossier. "Donovan, what is the meaning of this?" Sidney's father demanded, his bluster faltering slightly under the oppressive tension radiating from the silent auditor. "Who is this woman?" Donovan did not look up from the paperwork immediately. He took his time, allowing the silence to stretch, forcing the family to sit in the uncomfortable void. Finally, he closed the folder, folded his hands on top of the documents, and looked directly at his father-in-law. "Bryce is not a victim," Donovan stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded absolute authority. "Bryce is a desperate criminal currently facing a $5 million margin call from his primary clearinghouse. His investment portfolio has completely collapsed." Sidney let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Bryce lunged forward, reaching for the folder, but Donovan simply placed his massive hand firmly over the documents, stopping the younger man effortlessly. "Sit down," Bryce Donovan commanded, a dangerous edge sharpening his tone. "You are out of options." Donovan turned his attention back to the stunned parents. In order to cover his catastrophic losses, Bryce engaged in severe federal identity theft. He utilized Sidney to steal Clara's Social Security number and tax information from a private residential file. He subsequently used those stolen credentials to falsify a corporate application for a $3 million commercial credit line. Lauren covered her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband and her sister in absolute shock. Sidney's mother grabbed the edge of the table, the color draining rapidly from her face as the reality of the situation crushed her righteous indignation. If Clara hands this specific dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Donovan continued his delivery, remaining as cold and detached as a judge reading a sentence. Bryce and Sidney will not be facing a civil dispute over a lease agreement. They will be facing a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Clara did not steal their apartment. She evicted a liability, and she froze their accounts to prevent them from laundering stolen money. The silence that followed Donovan's surgical deconstruction of Sidney's lies was deafening. The parents stared at their youngest daughter, their expressions mutating from protective outrage to profound, sickening horror. Sidney snapped. The realization that her carefully constructed victim narrative was destroyed by her own family member broke her remaining composure. She shrieked, slamming her hands against the table, knocking over a water glass. "You traitor!" Sidney screamed, directing her venom entirely at Donovan. Tears of pure rage streamed down her flushed cheeks. "You are supposed to be family. We took you in. You are supposed to protect us, and you are siding with this psychotic bitch. You sold us out." Donovan did not flinch at the verbal assault. He did not attempt to defend his loyalty to a family that had consistently treated him as a secondary citizen. He looked at Sidney with a profound, freezing contempt. "I am a senior auditor," Sidney Donovan replied quietly, the quiet intensity of his voice cutting through her hysterical screaming. "I analyze risk, and I document facts. I do not protect criminals." He stood up from the table, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate suit jacket. He looked down at Lauren, who was trembling in her seat, too stunned to speak. "I will be staying at the hotel tonight," Lauren Donovan stated, severing his connection to the toxic environment with a single sentence. "I suggest you decide where your loyalties lie before the federal indictments are unsealed." Donovan turned and walked away from the table, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the crowded restaurant. He did not look back. I remained standing behind Sidney's chair, observing the absolute devastation of the family structure. The parents sat in stunned silence, realizing their daughter was not a victim, but a felon. Bryce stared blankly at the folder his financial execution documented in black and white. Sidney sobbed into her hands, her illusions of power and superiority entirely incinerated. The tribunal had rendered its verdict, and the sentence was total destruction. But the cornered animal still had one desperate, violent move left to make. The devastation at the bistro stripped Bryce of his final layer of insulation. His fabricated reality shattered completely, leaving him exposed to the ruthless mechanics of institutional debt. Sidney's family immediately severed all contact, terrified of federal entanglement. Lauren packed her bags and relocated to a hotel, effectively ending her marriage to the auditor, who refused to protect her sister's crimes. The isolation was absolute. But for Bryce, the social exile was secondary to the lethal mounting pressure of his financial obligations. The margin call was past due. The institutional creditors initiated aggressive collection protocols, and the shadow lenders he engaged to sustain his cryptocurrency leveraged positions began issuing direct physical threats against his life. Bryce was no longer a frantic broker navigating a difficult quarter. He was a hunted man facing imminent destruction, and desperation breeds extreme, unpredictable violence. The transition from corporate espionage to a physical ambush occurred less than 24 hours after Donovan's revelation. At 7 o'clock the following morning, I descended into the subterranean parking garage beneath my newly acquired residential tower. The sprawling concrete structure was eerily silent, the ambient noise of the city muffled by layers of reinforced steel. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast stark, elongated shadows across the polished floor. I walked toward my reserved parking bay, the sharp click of my heels echoing in the empty space. My mind was already parsing the morning data streams, preparing for a routine day of neutralizing corporate threats. I reached for the handle of my SUV. Before my fingers grazed the metal, a sudden erratic movement caught my peripheral vision. A shadow detached itself from the thick concrete pillar adjacent to my vehicle. Bryce lunged out of the darkness. The polished, arrogant finance bro was entirely gone. He looked feral. His designer suit was violently wrinkled, stained with sweat and the grime of the city streets. Dark, bruised circles hung heavily beneath his bloodshot, manic eyes. He had clearly not slept since the restaurant. He moved with a jerky, unpredictable aggression, driven entirely by raw panic and adrenaline. He closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. He did not attempt to negotiate. He did not ask for a conversation. He aggressively invaded my physical space, forcing me to stumble backward until my spine slammed hard against the cold driver's side door of my SUV. Bryce raised his right arm, driving a heavy, blunt metallic object concealed beneath the fabric of his jacket directly into my ribs. The pressure was intense, threatening to crack bone. I could feel the rigid cylindrical shape of a firearm pressing against my side. "Do not scream!" Bryce hissed, his breath hot and reeking of stale alcohol and sheer terror. "Do not make a single sound or I will end you right here on the concrete." I did not scream. I did not flail or attempt to wrestle the concealed weapon from his trembling grip. I maintained absolute, terrifying stillness. I locked my eyes onto his bloodshot gaze, rapidly assessing the volatility of the threat. The safety protocols of my profession dictate clinical detachment in crisis scenarios. Panic is a luxury I cannot afford. Bryce raised his left hand, clutching a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. He shoved the images inches from my face, his hands shaking so violently the pictures rattled against each other. "Look at them," Bryce demanded, spittle flying from his lips. "Look at what I have." I forced my eyes to focus on the top photograph. It was an image of me sitting in a private, dimly lit hotel suite with a prominent, elderly foreign dignitary, a highly classified client requiring discreet risk management consultation. The subsequent photos depicted similar scenarios: clandestine meetings, sealed briefcases exchanging hands, and encrypted data transfers occurring in shadowed environments. The original contexts were entirely legitimate, heavily guarded corporate operations. However, the images Bryce held had been digitally manipulated with meticulous, malicious intent. The angles were cropped, the lighting altered, and the sequence arranged to imply a sinister narrative. The photographs were meticulously crafted to suggest I was engaging in illicit espionage, corporate bribery, and potentially treasonous financial arrangements. It was a sophisticated, devastating smear campaign designed to destroy my security clearance and annihilate my career trajectory instantly upon publication. "Transfer $3 million into this offshore routing account immediately." Bryce snarled, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his own extortion attempt. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper bearing a complex string of international routing numbers against my chest. "You have the liquidity, Clara. We both know you do. You initiate the wire transfer right now, or I swear to God, I will pull this trigger." He leaned in closer, grinding the concealed weapon harder against my ribs. "And if you somehow survive the bullet," Bryce continued, his eyes wide and completely unhinged, "I have an automated dead man switch programmed on my laptop. If the funds do not clear the offshore account within 30 minutes, these photographs will be distributed to every major financial news outlet, every federal regulatory agency, and every corporate board you consult for. I will burn your entire reputation to the ground. You will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary defending yourself against treason charges. The conflict had escalated from a battle of financial attrition to a direct, lethal threat against my life and my legacy. Bryce was demanding I empty my reserves to cover his debts, offering my physical safety and my professional credibility in exchange for his survival. The knife was firmly pressed against my throat. I did not break eye contact. I did not beg for my life or plead for a compromise. I analyzed his frantic breathing, the tremor in his hands, and the desperate, hollow look in his eyes. He was not a hardened killer. He was a coward pushed past his breaking point, clinging to a fabricated narrative of control. I took a slow, measured breath, ensuring my voice remained as cold and level as the concrete floor beneath us. "You believe $3 million will save you, Bryce?" I asked softly, the quiet intensity of my tone causing him to blink in confusion. "You believe an offshore account will protect you from the institutional forces currently hunting you down?" "Shut up and initiate the transfer," Bryce roared, shifting his weight aggressively. I did not move my hands toward my phone. I slowly, deliberately lowered my right arm, sliding my hand smoothly into the depths of my leather tote bag hanging from my shoulder. "I am simply pointing out the flaw in your logic, Bryce." I continued, my fingers brushing past my wallet and closing around a small, smooth electronic device hidden in the lining of my purse. "Even if I execute the wire transfer, the federal authorities already possess the digital footprint of your initial identity theft. Buying time from the syndicate does not erase the federal indictments waiting for you. You are a dead man walking regardless of my compliance." Bryce's face contorted in absolute fury. He realized my words were true, but his manic desperation refused to accept reality. He tightened his grip on the concealed weapon, preparing to force the issue through sheer violence. The standoff reached its critical terminal threshold, but the execution of my countermeasure was already complete. "You think I will not do it?" Bryce roared, the sound echoing harshly off the concrete pillars. His bravado was fracturing, giving way to a frantic, uncontrolled aggression. "You think I am bluffing?" He did not wait for a response. The remaining shreds of his restraint snapped. He released his grip on the fabricated photographs, letting the glossy paper flutter uselessly to the garage floor. He grabbed the lapels of my tailored blazer with his free hand, twisting the fabric tightly into his fist. The sudden violent force ripped the seams near the shoulder. Before I could brace myself, he shoved me backward with a brutal shoving thrust. My spine slammed against the sloped hood of my SUV. The impact forced the breath from my lungs in a sharp gasp. Bryce instantly lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight over me, pinning me against the cold metal chassis. He drove the concealed cylindrical object harder into my side. Through the thin material of his jacket, I could feel the object vibrating, trembling uncontrollably in his panicked grip. A sharp, cruel laugh echoed through the cavernous garage. Sydney emerged from the shadows near the elevator bank. She did not rush forward in horror. She did not attempt to de-escalate the violent assault on her former roommate. She walked slowly toward the vehicle, her face illuminated by the bright screen of her smartphone. She held the device horizontally, the recording light blinking a steady, rhythmic red. "Execute the wire transfer," Clara Sydney commanded. Her voice carried a sickening, theatrical lilt, completely detached from the reality of the physical violence occurring before her. She was reveling in the perceived shift of power, thrilled by the opportunity to document my submission. "You sit on a mountain of hoarded wealth while we drown in debt. You owe us this capital. What is a few $1,000,000 compared to your miserable life? Just authorize the transaction, and we will walk away." She stood mere feet away, framing the shot, an active participant in an armed extortion plot. Her smile was vicious, a perfect reflection of her profound moral bankruptcy. She truly believed that holding a camera gave her immunity, insulating her from the consequences of the crime she was actively facilitating. The biological imperative in a situation like this is panic. The adrenal glands flood the system, urging the body to thrash, to scream for help, to fight back blindly against the immediate threat. But I am not governed by panic. Years of neutralizing corporate sabotage and managing high-stakes security breaches condition the mind to override base instincts. My brain processed the assault as a data set. Bryce's erratic breathing, Sydney's position, the layout of the garage. I did not flail against Bryce's weight. I did not scream for the non-existent bystanders. I forced my respiratory rate to slow, inhaling deeply through my nose and exhaling a steady, controlled breath. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Bryce's wide, bloodshot stare. I let a slow, freezing smirk touch the corners of my mouth. It was not a smile of surrender. It was a smile of absolute, chilling certainty. Bryce frowned, momentarily derailed by my complete lack of terror. His grip on my torn blazer faltered slightly. "Do you honestly believe, Bryce?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying the sharp, penetrating clarity of breaking glass. "Do you honestly believe that the subterranean parking facility of a residential tower, valued in the tens of millions of dollars, operates without an integrated high-level security network?" Sydney lowered her phone a fraction of an inch, a flicker of unease crossing her features. Bryce pressed the object harder into my ribs, attempting to regain control through physical pressure, but the doubt was already infecting his manic determination. I kept my hand concealed inside the depths of my leather tote bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and securely gripped the smooth, plastic casing of my vehicle's smart key fob. I located the small recessed button designated for the localized panic alarm. I did not press it. I bypassed the standard alarm feature entirely. My thumb shifted to the secondary textured button, a custom modification installed by my private cybersecurity team. I pressed the button twice in rapid succession. I did not trigger a loud wailing siren designed to scare away vandals. I triggered a silent, encrypted distress beacon. The signal bypassed local emergency dispatches and transmitted directly to the dedicated federal task force currently monitoring the investigation into Bryce's multi-million-dollar identity theft. The beacon relayed my exact GPS coordinates, accompanied by an automated Priority 1 alert indicating an active hostage scenario involving the primary suspect. The transmission took less than 2 seconds. The trap was permanently locked. There was no negotiation left to engage in. I lay pinned against the hood of my car, staring up at the man who thought he held my life in his hands, fully aware that his executioners were already mobilizing. "You talk too much," Clara, Bryce sneered, attempting to reassert his dominance, but his voice lacked conviction. He tightened his grip, raising his other hand, as if to strike me across the face. "Stop playing games and authorize the offshore transfer right now." I maintained my icy smile. I reached into my bag and pulled out my mobile device, offering the screen up toward his face. "Let us process the transaction." "Bryce," I agreed softly, watching the false hope reignite in his desperate eyes. "Let us see how far this money takes you." I held my smartphone steady, angling the screen so Bryce could clearly observe the interface. My thumb tapped the banking application icon. The biometric scan authorized my access instantly. I navigated to the international wire transfer portal with deliberate, unhurried motions. Bryce leaned his weight heavily onto my chest, his erratic breathing fogging the chilled air in the subterranean garage, his eyes locked onto the glowing screen, wide and frantic, tracking every movement of my finger. Sydney stepped closer, aiming the camera lens of her device directly at my phone screen, eager to document the capitulation she believed would secure her future. I input the offshore routing numbers Bryce had provided on his crumpled piece of paper. I navigated to the amount field. I typed a 3 followed by 6 zeros, $3 million. Bryce let out a harsh, ragged exhale, a sound caught somewhere between a sob and a triumphant laugh. The crushing pressure of the $5 million margin call momentarily lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the euphoric delusion of immediate salvation. "Confirm the transfer," Bryce commanded, spittle flying from his lips in his haste. "Do it now. Do not hesitate." I did not hesitate. I moved my thumb over the large blue confirmation button resting at the bottom of the display. I pressed the screen. A small, animated loading circle spun for exactly 3 seconds. The display refreshed. A green checkmark appeared, accompanied by crisp, bold text. "Transaction successful. Funds disbursed." Bryce exhaled violently, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. He removed the concealed heavy metallic object from my ribs, shoving it clumsily back into the inner pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket. He stepped back from the hood of my SUV, releasing his aggressive grip on the torn fabric of my blazer. Sydney lowered her phone, a massive, arrogant smile splitting her face. She looked at Bryce, her eyes shining with the greedy satisfaction of a successful heist. "We did it," she whispered, practically vibrating with adrenaline. They believed they had executed the perfect extortion. They believed they had forced a multimillionaire to finance their escape from institutional debt. They turned their backs on me, prepared to flee the garage retreat to a safe location and wait for the stolen capital to reflect in their offshore ledger. They did not understand the architecture of the trap they had just triggered. The offshore routing numbers Bryce provided were legitimate. The banking institution located in the Cayman Islands was a real entity. However, the specific account destination was not controlled by Bryce or his shadow creditors. When I discovered the initial identity theft involving my Social Security number, I did not merely alert the authorities. I engaged my elite cybersecurity team. They collaborated directly with the Federal Cybercrimes Division to establish a highly sophisticated countermeasure. We engineered a digital honeypot. My security team manipulated the routing protocols within my primary banking interface. When I inputted Bryce's offshore account numbers, the system automatically engaged a bypass algorithm. The $3 million did not travel to the Cayman Islands. The capital was routed directly into a secure, heavily monitored federal holding account maintained by the Department of Justice. The transaction I just executed was not a surrender of funds. It was the activation sequence for a digital guillotine. By forcing me to press that confirmation button under the threat of physical violence, Bryce generated an irrefutable time-stamped digital record of direct extortion and attempted money laundering. The transaction served as the absolute smoking gun the federal prosecutors required to bypass lengthy grand jury proceedings and secure immediate emergency arrest warrants. Furthermore, the moment the transaction registered as successful, the banking application transmitted a secondary encrypted burst signal. The signal confirmed the extortion was complete and verified my precise location in the underground parking facility to the tactical units already mobilizing based on my earlier distress beacon. I pushed myself off the hood of the SUV. I smoothed the torn lapels of my blazer, restoring a fraction of my professional composure. I watched Bryce and Sydney take their first hurried steps toward the exit ramp. "The funds have cleared the primary processing node," I announced, my voice echoing clearly in the vast concrete cavern. Bryce paused mid-stride, glancing over his shoulder with a smug, dismissive sneer. "Thank you for your contribution to the fund, Clara," he mocked, entirely confident in his victory. "But you will never spend a single cent of that money." I continued, my tone dropping to a freezing, absolute calm. Bryce turned fully around, frowning. Sydney stopped beside him, her triumphant smile faltering. The quiet certainty in my voice pierced through the adrenaline fueling their escape attempt. "What are you talking about?" Bryce demanded, taking a half-step back toward me, the aggression beginning to resurface in his posture. "The offshore account you provided was a blind drop," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on his increasingly confused expression. "You did not wire $3 million to a shadow bank in the Cayman Islands, Bryce. You just authorized a direct transfer into a federal evidence holding account." Sydney gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I set a trap the moment you accessed my credit profile," I stated, laying out the reality of their destruction with clinical precision. "You just provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a time-stamped digital confession of armed extortion and wire fraud." Bryce stared at me, the color rapidly draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation crushed him. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers frantically grasping for the heavy metal object he had used to threaten me. He was preparing to escalate the violence, desperate to silence the executioner who had just dismantled his entire existence. He never got the chance to pull the weapon. The trap was already springing shut. The moment Bryce's fingers tightened around the concealed weapon in his jacket, the heavy silence of the subterranean garage shattered. The deafening high-pitched screech of heavy tires locking against polished concrete echoed off the pillars. 6 armored matte black SUVs roared down the entrance ramp, swerving with aggressive precision to form an impenetrable barricade across the primary exit routes. The vehicles had not even come to a complete halt before the heavy doors flew open. Dozens of federal agents wearing tactical gear, emblazoned with the letters FBI, poured out into the dim light. The chaotic symphony of slamming doors, shouting voices, and heavy boots hitting the pavement overwhelmed the space. Federal agents, drop the weapon and get on the ground. Keep your hands visible. The command boomed from an amplified megaphone rattling the windows of my parked SUV. Before Bryce could pull the object from his pocket, a dozen crimson laser sights pierced the gloom. The glowing red dots tracked rapidly across the concrete, settling in a concentrated lethal cluster directly over Bryce's chest. Several secondary lasers locked onto Sydney's torso. The illusion of their power dissolved in a fraction of a second. Bryce and Sydney were no longer arrogant extortionists demanding millions of dollars. They were desperate, surrounded fugitives trapped in the crosshairs of a federal tactical strike team. Bryce froze his eyes wide with a hollow, paralyzing terror. His hand, still buried inside his jacket pocket, began to shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The heavy metallic object slipped from his slick, sweating fingers. It tumbled downward, striking the concrete floor with a loud metallic clatter. It was not a firearm. It was a heavy steel tire pressure gauge he had scavenged from a toolkit, wrapped tightly in dark tape to simulate the barrel of a gun. He had bluffed using a crude prop to execute a multi-million-dollar extortion, and he had aimed that bluff directly at a woman who did not flinch. Drop to your knees. Now. The agents did not wait for compliance. Heavily armored officers swarmed the space flanking Bryce and Sydney with ruthless efficiency. The lead agent grabbed Bryce by the collar of his ruined suit jacket, hauling him forward and slamming him face down onto the freezing concrete floor. Bryce gasped as the impact knocked the wind from his lungs. An agent drove a heavy knee between Bryce's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground while brutally wrenching his arms behind his back. The distinct metallic ratcheting sound of heavy-duty handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply in the garage. Sydney let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. The reality of the tactical raid finally fractured her manic denial. She scrambled backward, attempting to flee toward the elevator bank, but an agent intercepted her immediately. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around and forcing her down onto the pavement. Sydney thrashed wildly, her designer boots scraping against the dirty concrete, her manicured nails clawing uselessly at the agent's tactical vest. She sobbed uncontrollably as the cold steel cuffs secured her wrists. I stood perfectly still near the hood of my SUV, observing the violent execution of the trap with clinical detachment. I did not scream. I did not cower. I calmly adjusted the torn collar of my blazer, maintaining my immaculate composure amidst the chaos. The lead special agent in charge, a tall, imposing man wearing a dark windbreaker, stepped forward into the center of the scene. He held a crisp white legal document in his right hand. Bryce Vance and Sydney Miller, the agent, announced, his voice carrying absolute, unyielding authority. You are both under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and armed extortion. Sydney stopped thrashing against the concrete. She twisted her neck, scraping her tear-streaked face against the dirty floor to look up at me. The mascara ran in dark, jagged lines down her pale cheeks. The arrogant public relations director was reduced to a sobbing, hysterical mess. She realized the depth of the deception. She realized every move she made over the past week had been anticipated, monitored, and leveraged against her. "You are a monster," Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated despair. She strained against the grip of the federal agents, her eyes wild with hatred. "You set us up. You planned this from the beginning. You lured us into a trap." I walked slowly across the concrete floor, closing the distance between my vehicle and the handcuffed woman writhing on the ground. The flashing red and blue strobes of the tactical vehicles cast long, sharp shadows across my face. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Sydney. I looked down into her terrified, bloodshot eyes. I let a cold, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. I am just a destitute freelancer who cannot pay her rent. "Sydney," I whispered softly, keeping my tone light and conversational, ensuring my voice barely carried over the ambient noise of the raid. I do not possess the capacity to engineer a federal sting operation. I leaned down slightly, maintaining eye contact, as the absolute certainty of my victory settled over her. "You are the one who wrote the script. I continued, my voice slicing through her hysterical sobbing like a scalpel. I merely directed the finale. I stood back up, breaking eye contact. I turned my back on the ruined couple and walked toward the lead FBI agent to deliver my official victim statement and hand over the secondary encrypted drive containing the full audio logs of their extortion attempts. Behind me, Sydney let out a long, hollow wail, a pathetic sound swallowed entirely by the authoritative shouts of the federal agents. The final effort of my enemies had become the very noose that executed them. The architecture of my retaliation was complete, and the stage was swept clean. 6 months passed since the flashing police strobes illuminated the concrete walls of the Subterranean parking garage. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty. I attended the final sentencing hearing on a brisk Tuesday morning. I wore a tailored navy blazer and took a seat in the back row of the gallery. I did not attend to gloat or make a public spectacle. I attended to witness the final accounting. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. Federal marshals escorted Bryce and Sydney into the sterile room. The visual transformation was striking. Bryce no longer wore bespoke suits or flashed leased luxury watches. He shuffled toward the defense table wearing a standard-issue drab prison uniform. His posture, once rigid with unearned superiority, was broken. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders rounded, a defeated man who finally understood the terminal reality of federal wire fraud. Sydney walked behind him. The polished elite public relations director was entirely gone. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were seized by the government to pay for restitution. She wore the same coarse uniform as her boyfriend. Her hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limp and unkempt around her pale, exhausted face. She looked older, drained of the venomous energy that once fueled her cruelty. The federal judge struck the wooden sounding block with a heavy gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the silent courtroom, finalizing the destruction of their fabricated lives. The judge detailed the extensive identity theft, the forged credit lines, and the attempted extortion. The sentencing was swift and unyielding. Bryce received 12 years in a federal penitentiary. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his chained hands. The reality of spending over a decade behind bars crushed whatever remained of his ego. Sydney received 5 years for her role as an active accomplice in the conspiracy. A ragged, hollow sob escaped her throat. Her knees gave out, forcing the marshals to support her weight. She turned her head, scanning the gallery through tear-streaked eyes. She found me sitting in the back row. I did not smile. I did not offer a victorious smirk. I maintained a flat, clinical gaze. She looked away, suffocating under the weight of her permanent disgrace. They lost their freedom, their social standing, and their dignity. The fallout extended beyond the courtroom. The exposure of their crimes shattered their remaining social circles. The elite guests who attended Sydney's cocktail parties severed all contact, terrified of federal subpoenas. Her family retreated into silence, eager to distance themselves from a convicted felon. Donovan, the sharp senior auditor, who handed me the initial warning, recognized the rot inside his marital family. He filed for divorce from Lauren the morning after the disastrous restaurant tribunal. He executed the separation with the same surgical precision he applied to corporate ledgers. He refused to anchor his life to people who excused criminal behavior for the sake of social appearances. I recognized Donovan's rare intellect and unshakable integrity. I did not let a talent of that caliber slip away. 3 days after the trial concluded, Donovan walked into the glass-walled conference room at my corporate headquarters. He wore a dark, immaculate suit projecting a calm, commanding presence. I slid a leather-bound employment contract across the polished mahogany table. I offered him the position of chief audit executive for my primary risk management firm. Donovan opened the folder, scanning the generous compensation package and the extensive authority the role provided. He did not hesitate. He retrieved a silver pen from his breast pocket and signed his name on the dotted line. We shook hands. We did not need to discuss the past. We operated in the same currency. We valued data logic and accountability. That afternoon, I returned to my private residence. I bypassed the standard tenant floors and took the secured elevator directly to the penthouse. The sprawling apartment offered an uninterrupted panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the pristine living space in golden late-afternoon sunlight. The air smelled of expensive cedar and quiet solitude. The toxic, suffocating atmosphere Sydney once generated was eradicated, replaced by pure serenity. The private elevator chimed. Mr. Russo, the senior representative for the property management group, stepped into the foyer. He did not look at me with the dismissive pity he once reserved for struggling renters. He carried himself with deep, formal respect. He held a thick, leather-bound ledger containing the financial performance metrics for the residential tower. Mr. Russo walked over to the marble island where I stood. He placed the dossier gently on the stone surface, bowing his head in a polite greeting. "Good afternoon, Ms. Davis." Mr. Russo said, his tone deferential. "The monthly rent collections for the entire building have been processed and routed into your holding company. The structural maintenance updates are on schedule, and the tenant retention rate remains flawless. The building is operating at peak profitability." "Thank you, Mr. Russo," I replied, offering a brief acknowledging nod. "Your continued efficiency is appreciated." He turned and exited the penthouse, leaving me alone in the expansive space. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up a delicate porcelain cup filled with hot green tea. I moved toward the towering glass windows, looking down at the chaotic, rushing gridlock of the city streets far below. The yellow taxis and hurried pedestrians looked like tiny, insignificant components of a massive ticking machine. I took a slow sip of the steaming tea. The ceramic was warm against my palms. I thought about the woman who used to occupy the smaller bedroom in this building. I thought about the evening she intentionally kicked a crystal wine glass at my feet, demanding I clean up her mess. I remembered the vile, fabricated rumors she spread to her wealthy friends, painting me as a desperate, ruined woman. I remembered the cheap black apron she forced me to wear, trying to brand me as a servant in my own domain. The person who threw wine on my clothes and mocked my supposed poverty was currently trading her designer wardrobe for a prison uniform. She was learning to survive in a concrete cell while I stood in a penthouse overlooking the financial capital of the world. I did not need to scream to prove my value. I did not need to throw tantrums, hurl insults, or engage in petty dramatic screaming matches to defend my honor. The truth does not require volume. The truth only requires a stage, and I built the stage with undeniable documented facts. Money and legal documents are the sharpest weapons a person can wield. They do not rely on emotion. They rely on leverage. When a predator attempts to back you into a corner, you do not fight them with tears. You fight them with contracts, digital firewalls, and federal statutes. You let their own greed blind them to the trap you carefully construct around their feet. The destruction of Bryce and Sydney was not an act of petty vengeance. Vengeance is messy, emotional, and exhausting. What I orchestrated was the swift, undeniable restoration of order. They attempted to steal my identity and weaponize my success to cover their own failures. I simply utilized the legal and financial systems to correct their mathematical error. I handed the authorities the mirror, and the authorities executed the penalty. I set my teacup down on the small glass table beside me. I looked at my reflection in the window pane, superimposed over the glittering skyscrapers. I saw a woman who refused to be a victim. I saw a professional who controlled her environment with lethal, silent precision. I did not just survive a hostile eviction and a federal identity theft. I purchased the battlefield, rewrote the rules of engagement, and permanently eliminated the threat. I am Clara, and I am the sole architect of this empire. The keys are firmly in my hand, and the doors are locked from the inside. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the city lights ignite as dusk settles over Manhattan. The memory of Sydney intentionally shattering a crystal glass at my feet feels distant, yet the mechanics of her downfall remain a pristine study in human behavior. I did not survive that toxic apartment by accident, and the blueprint of my exit offers 3 distinct realities. First, understand that genuine power never announces itself. The loudest person in a room is invariably the most vulnerable. Sydney and Bryce relied on leased watches, cruel jokes, and aggressive posturing to validate their fragile existence. They equated volume with authority. I learned that you do not need to defend your dignity to people committed to misunderstanding you. Let them believe their own illusions. Embrace being underestimated. Your silence is not a surrender. It is a vault they cannot breach. True leverage does not require an audience until the exact moment of execution. Second, never interrupt a predator while they are constructing their own trap. Toxic individuals are driven by a parasitic hunger that blinds them to risk. When Bryce stole my personal data, he believed he had cornered a helpless victim. He failed to realize his greed was a highly predictable algorithm. If you encounter people who attempt to extort your resources or damage your reputation, do not panic. Do not rush to confront them. Step back. Give them the rope, document their overreach meticulously, and let their own reckless momentum pull them over the edge. The most devastating retaliation is simply allowing their choices to reach a natural legal conclusion. Third, boundaries are constructed with infrastructure, not emotion. Engaging in screaming matches, shedding tears, and pleading for moral decency are wasted efforts on manipulative people. They feed on your distress. If you want to neutralize a threat, remove your emotions from the equation entirely. Utilize contracts, digital firewalls, and federal statutes. Build a perimeter forged from hard data and severe legal consequences. You do not owe toxic people your peace of mind, your financial stability, or a second chance. You only owe them the door. I built my empire quietly, and I protect it with clinical precision. The keys are in my hand, and the foundation is secured in stone. If you have ever maintained a calm smile while arrogant people unknowingly dug their own graves, I want to hear your experience. Drop your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Hazel Tells Stories. We explore the sharp edges of human behavior, the necessity of ironclad boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of ultimate justice. Remember, the truth does not need to shout. It only needs